Welcome to this episode of the Upfront Podcast. As always, I am your host, Nina Mueller, and this is the place where you get your dose of upfront and honest conversations with people from all around the world. Enjoy the show. My guest today is Ainhoa Martinelli. Ainhoa is from Switzerland and 19 years old. She works in a Montessori school and will begin to study geography in the fall. Ainhoa had started her activist work in her early teenage years with Fridays for Future. She is now an active part of various international climate movements, such as the Global Climate Strike, Debt for Climate, and the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, which makes her the perfect person to talk to about the issues we're all going to have to face. Ainhoa and I will be talking about activist burnout, the dark side of volunteer tourism, what the climate movement has to do with the exploitation of formerly colonized countries, and how Eurocentrism, privilege, and inequity are often disregarded factors that should be taken into account in environmental discussions. We are also talking about how our consumerist ways are hindering environmental protection efforts and what we can actually do to decrease the pace at which this planet is dying. I would like to preface this conversation by giving you some recent facts on the state of the climate crisis. The Amazon, which is also called the lungs of our Earth, is still being deforested at a rapid rate. Consumerism is at an all-time high. Greenwashing has become a regular marketing strategy for fast fashion brands. Planet Earth is completely overpopulated. The International Civil Aviation Organization has publicly announced that we're almost back to pre-pandemic air travel numbers, and the automotive industry is increasing. All of these factors add to the enormous amount of carbon dioxide that is being released. This results in a new record of the highest ever measured temperature of the Mediterranean Sea at 28.71 degrees Celsius in July 2023. And the month of July overall is confirmed to have had the highest temperatures on record. Countless nations around the globe are experiencing floods, fires, landslides, earthquakes, sinkholes, and other natural catastrophes that can be linked directly to climate change. I would like to add a short mention of the dead zones here, as Ainhoa has told me about. There are already dead zones on our planet, which the Scientific American states, fortunately, these dead zones are reversible if their causes are reduced or eliminated. Now for an outlook into our future. If we cannot reach our environmental goals, we will be obliged to determine a larger dead zone, of which some researchers suggest 2,000 kilometers north and 2,000 kilometers south of the equator. This dead zone will become practically uninhabitable to most living beings. I hope this conversation will raise the level of awareness and does make you talk about these important issues with the people closest to you, because we can only do this together. Hi, Ainhoa. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm a little bit tired, but I'm doing fine.
Oh,
Thanks.
well, that's good to hear. Thank you so much for doing this today. I'm really excited to have you on.
Thank you for having me. I'm also very excited.
Could you please tell me a bit about yourself first off?
So, hi, I'm Ainhoa. I'm living in Bern in Switzerland, and I'm learning how to be an environmental, social, and economical just activist. Or I try to decolonize the perspective I have on Earth and kind of then spreading the things I get to know in my activist bubble.
So going back when you were a child, what did you want to become when you grew up? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah, that's actually a very funny question because I wanted to become everything, like from a doctor to a teacher to a farmer. So then I just thought, why not becoming a secret agent? Because if you're a secret agent, then you can be everything. Like you can go undercover as a doctor or as a teacher. Yeah, and I'm still wanting to become everything. I am now starting to study geography in autumn in Bern as the science of science that combines also a little bit everything, and also what I'm doing for activism is really rooted in geography.
That sounds really interesting. How do you personally prevent getting burnt out with your activist activity and still having the energy to, fight for your plea and not getting burnt out doing so? Because a lot of things, especially when it comes to environment, a lot of policy changes take a lot of time. So I could imagine that's quite difficult to handle.
Yes, indeed. I'm quite familiar with activism burnout or burnout activism. Like I started when I was like around 15, 16 years old, with the whole Fridays for Future movement from Sweden, from Greta Thunberg, and all my friends were like similar ages. So we didn't really know a lot about how the world is functioning, like how the system is working. But what we knew for sure is that there's something out there that we are heading closer and closer towards, and something that will end us up or bring us all into a big crisis, like climate crisis. So we also knew that it would be preventable. So we knew that it kind of came out of the extractivism that we do as human, that we need for our way of living. So it was pretty exhausting because we constantly like pointed towards the solutions and towards how we could actually solve it, and no one kind of was listening to us. So this was like the first time that we, after all those demonstrations and strikes on the streets, we kind of got burned out because we realized, okay, no one is listening to us. They're just telling us that we should start with ourselves and like not using takeaway cups or going with the car to the strikes or whatever. And now looking back towards then, I can see that it was a very like Eurocentric perspective on the whole crisis and on the whole system, and that it's not actually us little white children that are saving our earth, but that the whole climate crisis is actually a symptom of a very structural, systematic default in the way of our society, or in the way of how we live together in our world, and that we as children in Switzerland are actually quite privileged in this whole situation, that we can like phrase it in a way that in future there's something that comes towards us and it like will destroy everything we know right now. So when the first activism burnout kind of happened with me and my friends, that's when we realized, okay, we can, if we really want to change something, we have actually to start with ourselves, but not with like individualistic stuff, which is also important. But like if I use my wooden straw to save the world while a billionaire is chatting with his private jets, is important to like raise your awareness around how to be sustainable, but still something way more deeper has to happen. And then we thought about like what was leading us to a burnout, and we recognized like capitalistic structures in our own movement and this Eurocentric, very colonized movement, in a way that we are the saviors of our whole world, and everyone is like kind of depending on us, and completely ignoring what was already out there, like all those fights from indigenous people or by people from the global south that were fighting against this structural default in our systems in like 5 decades or whatever. So kind of a decolonization process started, and we got to interact with a lot of people from the global south, from all over the world. And this is kind of where the second burnout activism kind of started, in a way that we now knew about all those connections between different struggles between women, queer people that are fighting against the system, like poor people that are fighting against people, or oppressed people, or racism, or people that have to flee because of extractivism or lithium mining, coal mining yeah, so we got to know all those terrible, tragic stories, and we kind of knew that it's our responsibility, that their lives hold so many struggles. Like, you're very aware of your privilege and you feel very bad. So then there's this stage and you feel like, okay, I'm telling all those stories in my social environment. We are telling it to politicians, and there's still no change coming. Maybe in society there's more awareness around that, but still, it's like, it's so frustrating. It's so, everything takes so long to change. And the climate crisis is happening right now. And then what? And then you feel bad because you feel bad. So now, kind of trying to figure out how to use this anger that builds up in yourself. How can you use this to build energy of resistance? And it's always a little bit a mixture. Like, sometimes you are very blocked and very sad because of all what is happening in our world, and then suddenly a wave of energy hits us again. And I see that it's very, very problematic that so many privileged people here in the global north are feeling this eco-anxiety that I also feel, because, as I already said, people are fighting against the same struggles since 5 decades, and they're still fighting. And there's like this very beautiful stories that the indigenous people are protecting our earth and saving our climate. They're not intentionally protecting the earth, they're just like fighting in order to survive. When I talk with my friends, like, often something when we talk about like drawing or living in the moment or like having fun together, we sometimes feel like, yeah, what does it even matter? Like, I should use all my time that I have to invest in a system change. But then you realize, okay, yeah, but that's again maybe a little bit a colonial thing or white superiority thinking. Like, we need to save those other people. So it's like a lot. You want to be like very political correct and do everything right. And this is, if you want to be perfect, that's like a very blockage. So you start procrastinating. And what helps also in these moments is that even though all those people in the global south that have so many struggles and that are suppressed by, like, if you look at the financial system, how it's working right now, like with the World Bank and the IMF, International Monetary Fund, you can see that since the starting point of where like the colonies freed the countries that they have colonized, they gave them like a start credit. But with the start credit, it wasn't like a gift, but it was like you have to pay them back. And since then, those countries are like indebted by this country in the global south are indebted by the countries in the global north. Yeah, they're still relying, they still depend on the global north. So there's still colonial reliance in a way. What they have preserved is a very healthy way of living. I think we kind of forgot what life's actually about. Since we're little, from school on, we get kind of in this highway of becoming successful and becoming a lot of money and being popular, having a lot of friends. I'm like always living kind of a little bit in the future. Like, oh yeah, if I'm finishing school, then I have then time to go on vacation. When we start working, then it's the weekend and then I can relax and enjoy. Or when I have a lot of money, then I will be happy. So it's very more materialistic. Whereas we just always thought we have to function and no emotions, but being very rational and with scientific facts in order that like adults will understand us and like kind of trust us or taking us seriously. The relationships between us activists is never really in the center of all our activism. It's just always the numbers, like the 1.5 degree, then becoming net zero, like in the activist bubble around climate crisis. And now we realize it's so, like, it's important to have those numbers, kind of.
As a set goal or something.
As a set goal, yes. But then, like, there are many ways how you can reach those goals.
So what would you say is something that people most often misunderstand about the climate strike movement?
That's an interesting question. Like,
because I understand you're much further from like the very simple, oh, it's not man-made, we still have time, it's not reversible anyhow, or all of these arguments that are very simple and at the very base of it. I believe, and I can hear that you're in a much more complex state of mind when it comes to, differentiating between using your privilege, but also being aware of it and using it for to amplify people that are on the forefront, such as Indigenous people and in the South especially, that are going to face a lot more dangers than, let's say, more privileged people higher north will face, or just sooner, I guess. But then what do you think is like a common misconception amongst like the general population, so to speak? What do they misunderstand about the climate strike movement?
Yeah, I guess it's like the thought that we want to take away a lot of things that make life enjoyable, like that we want to forbid electricity and meat, yeah, and everything that makes our life so fun. And then we often also get like the headline of, oh, they just want to have a eco-feminist dictatorship or something like that, which in itself is quite a funny expression. Yeah, but that we are against all the workers and against all the farmers, and that what we want is like we can never achieve this. But actually we are very a grassroots movement, so on the ground. And we more and more realize that it's all about like organizing people that are around you and building kind of a dual power, like still relying on politicians and stuff, but because they're so slow, all those decisions they're making, like stepping in and taking over this task of making transparent how our financial system looks like, making transparent some scientific stuff, but also reconnecting to what life is actually about, or like figuring out together. If I say we try to organize people, instead we are coming out of this mindset of, okay, one simple decision of mine, sharing a car or using this wooden straw, nothing will change. And also if I raise my voice against something that is very unjust or against the discrimination, like I'm going to feel very bad, and they will then also be against me, so my life is going to be miserable, so I just like shut up. But actually going to change this mindset and say, okay, if you have a voice and you can use it, and while you're using it, you can actually change a lot already, like in your social environment. Sorry, I'm making very long, complicated sentences.
That's all right.
I guess that's also like a symptom of being an activist. You have long discussions with people that have maybe different opinions than you, and you try to understand them, you try to empathetically listening to them, and then you try to find like connecting dots. So you're just constantly running around and you're not really taking care of yourself, so you're not sleeping, and then your mind gets a little bit tired, and then you're making so many long sentences.
That's totally fine. Not to be ageist here at all, but do you think the issue with politicians not taking it as seriously as they should is because they're usually quite old, and on some level, consciously, subconsciously, they're aware that they're, sorry to be morbid, but they're going to die before anything really troubling hits them personally? Do you think that is the issue? That they're just too old usually?
Yeah, it could be that, like, you see it, that often people get or see themselves or raise their voices if they're being affected by it. And if we have this future narrative, or we've had this future narrative so strong, and we really do not see the impacts of climate crisis that well, for example, in Switzerland. So yeah, it could definitely be. But also because a lot of those big politicians, especially in Switzerland, that block those decisions, they somehow a connection to those big companies that make profit from extractivism. And I think it's often just they're not aware. There are so many stories that are being said in our society, like, for example, almost, yeah, capitalism is nature law, everything else doesn't work. Yeah, or norms, I would say norms. And it's just like unchangeable. We've been like this forever, and this is the only way it works. So we don't really want to change. And I guess this also, like, sometimes the older you get, maybe those people were also activists when they were younger, but they then kind of came into the system, into the working system, into this political system, and they realized, they didn't even realize, they just like kind of got adjusted, that people like them, that they're being voted. Yeah, they just kind of get lazy.
And I do believe you're correct on that. Lining their own pockets could maybe be preferential to them at some point, instead of focusing on their political agendas that they once promised, which is a shame. But, well, I guess that's how some people work. When people say that the climate crisis isn't man-made, how do you respond to that? I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, then I refer to like scientific studies. Like there are a lot of nice diagrams that can show how much the CO2 emission was increasing since the industrialization, and how it looked like before, just showing them different studies, but then also putting the climate crisis into a bigger spectrum. For example, right now with this whole energy revolution, in a way, like going from a diesel car to an electric car. For all those batteries, you're using lithium, cobalt, copper, and those rare earths, they're also coming from like mining, where people work under very, very unhealthy working conditions, very not social working conditions. So like I respond on the argument, but then I also respond in the other way, like that it's not just about the CO2 emissions, and it doesn't actually matter whether it's man-made or not, or it does matter, but the issue lies way more deep. Like also in international affairs, it's like just always, how can we make the situation most profitable around money, but not like around human lives. In those discussions where like it's often white cis men that are using those arguments, but also other people.
Yeah,
but
it's so true.
If you're trying to find a connection point between these people and yourself, I often go over consumption. The consumption is very, very big, like so many clothes, so many like little plastic things or whatever, and they see like the very big issue with that. And if you can tie this back to the way our economy is working right now, and kind of then also tie it to the climate crisis or whatever, they kind of forget this argument. Yeah, it's not even human made, because they then see that it's like about something whole differently. Like it's about the way we live right now together, and that it's very unjust. Sometimes we don't need to convince these old white cis men, because they're on the track of extinction. So like working on towards building your utopia with the people that are listening to you and are eager to work with you for this utopia, is much more sustainable sometimes.
For sure. Now, speaking of something local where you are living, the recycling efforts in Switzerland, I find those quite astonishing. Really, they're really good. But do you think that is enough on a sort of private citizen level?
That's again a very good question. So Switzerland and recycling. Yeah, I guess Switzerland does actually a pretty good job with recycling, and it's like very important. But a lot of politicians use this good working together as an excuse to not actually systematically change something, because they say, "Oh, we've already done so much," and they are denying the impact Switzerland actually has in a lot of different countries, that they cannot invest in recycling projects or whatever, but are just constantly fighting with their debt or corruption or whatever. So, and I guess it's also like recycling is very good in a way. Like you can still produce so much, and then recycle. So you really don't have to change that much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, true. But I think in terms of overconsumption, I can't really judge in Switzerland locally. But I think the recycling efforts is a good starting point. But then what I noticed is that there's practically no upcycling really. There are some like Facebook groups where you can like no buy groups and stuff like that, or where you can like give away stuff for free, which is great. Because it gives an item a longer life cycle. But there's just not a big market, I think, for like secondhand items, for example. Would you agree with that?
I think there is actually a big sector of like upcycling or secondhand, but it's more like it adds to the problem. Like it's more also there. It's not really used to fix the issue, but used for an excuse. So people are saying, yeah, I give my old clothes to the secondhand store so I can buy something new, like, but something new from fast fashion. So there is a movement, like we have reparation coffees where people, or like the mentality, at least in my bubble, and also a little bit extended bubble, is changing, that people are starting to repair their clothes, their technical devices, their furniture more and more and more. And there are also places opening where you can actually repair this stuff. Yeah, people are becoming more aware of their consumption. But it's also like sometimes it's also a little bit hypocrite or a little bit strange, like with this second-hand sector. Like I know from two big, it's not actually companies, but maybe NGOs where you can like give your clothes and sending it to poor people in other countries. But by that, they are actually like kind of destroying the flourishing economy in these countries. And they have so many clothes that are being shipped to those countries that they just have like massive mountains of clothing. So like really, really upcycling or whatever, yeah, it's not quite there yet.
Can I ask you whether you know something about Tax Aid in Switzerland? This is a company with like donation boxes where you can drop off anything, clothing, shoes, books, and the like. But I was made aware that they apparently have come into a lot of money, and I do wonder if that is their only business. How is that working? It's supposed to be donations. You're not really supposed to make any profit off of that, right? I mean,
yeah, that's true. I've heard about like different similar stories, like all those NGOs that sometimes are doing a very good job, and like they're doing this, or like they're treating the symptoms that are being created, like this, but they're also profiting from the situation. So they are, I think, selling these donations to some, or they are creating conditions under what people that rely on those donations can get these donations. Yeah, it's like also in this whole saver helping donation sector, there's a lot of corruption, or like things that are going on that are very intransparent, and they're kind of also using this feeling, this need of us privileged white people, this like need to help. They're misusing us in a way, called volunteer tourism. So you go into other countries and you feel bad for, like, for example, flying there or for going there. So you want to give something back to the society that is living there. So you're, for example, volunteering in a orphanage, or you're volunteering in an animal rescue. But if you dive deeper, then you see like that it's actually a very big, very dramatic, tragic business. So a lot of these orphanages, like the children aren't actually orphans, but the parents have like sold their children in these orphanages, and those orphanages, they like get donations. The people that are giving them donation money, that they're like keeping the orphanage houses very poor looking, even though they could invest in improving the beds or like improving the food or whatever. And also in animal rescue centers, they're often more like zoos, and it's more about the experience for the tourist, but the actual issue, but the actual problem. And you have like a good feeling because you helped something. Like there's, I think, a very good TED talk on volunteer tourism. But yeah,
I'll
you have
definitely
to
have a look
be,
at that one that you're referring to. I'll have it linked in the show notes.
and that's like there's so much stuff going on, and it's sometimes very overwhelming. But like for example, in this specific scenario, it gives you kind of hope because people are trying to improve the status quo. They are trying to help. They're trying to give back. So these are actually all people that want to change something. So if you can get them on the same side in a way and can get them to raise their voices, and if they actually know what's going on, if we are able to build this dual power, yeah, the world can actually change towards a world where humans or people are before profit and like people are working together. And maybe this brings me back to the question you asked me before, like how is climate strike misunderstood? It's always we are working against everyone else, but no one actually listens to us. So we are not working against the people on, like, this is always an argument, like if you don't see that if we forbid cars, the people in the Alps, the farmers that depend on cars, that they're like going, that we are destroying their lives with this demand, but they are not seeing that we actually are aiming something, a network or whatever, that we can work together and like use a system of like car sharing, and that we want to listen to all the actual needs of the people on this planet and like also animals or whatever, find solutions together, not on the back of someone else, but together, that we can create like little ecosystem, functioning ecosystem that on a bigger scale also are connected to each other.
Mm. I'm sure you've heard of greenwashing in the fashion industry, particularly. So, for example, on Instagram or on YouTube and other social media channels, I see a lot of like those so-called influencers promoting Vivea, the shoe brand, and they are terribly greenwashing because when you actually look on their website, you have to dig a little deeper, but you can find the information on the website. It's produced in China, for example, and promoted then by influencers as being sustainable because they're made from recycled plastic bottles, apparently. Yet they're made under horrific circumstances. So the workers in China, they're shipped around the globe, and it's supporting the Chinese economy. And there's a lot more implications to being produced in China. How do you, in kind of practical tips, how do you shop sustainably for fashion and for clothing and stuff that you actually need? I'm not talking overconsumption here. I'm talking if you need a pair of shoes, for example. How do you shop sustainably?
Yeah, I just read in the article that we have actually right now enough clothes to for the next two generations that are coming to our earth, like for the next 30 years. And so just using what is already here. You mentioned upcycling before. Like if you need a new pair of shoes, there certainly will be a pair of shoes somewhere in this world. So using your social network, and maybe if they're broken, you can try to repair them, fix them. Also with clothes, maybe trying to create something new out of two separate pieces or whatever. I think this is the most sustainable way. Like we actually know how to be sustainable. We just de-learned it. Like we haven't, well, yeah. I don't know
Or
how to
too
say that in
lazy.
English. We are too lazy, but maybe also there's so many things that we need to achieve in order to be successful or whatever, like in this capitalistic thinking of living, like we need to earn money to live. We have this long shifts and then we are exhausted afterwards. Like we're doing unhumanly things in a lot of working sectors. So we think then there's no time anymore for things such as repairing or looking for clothing or whatever. And like with greenwashing, there's so many cool startups that are trying to solve problems with upcycling or using food waste, for example, to make leather, or also Wea. Like I think the starting idea is very good, but then like they adjust themselves to the current system of how our economy works. So they're wanting to get bigger and bigger and bigger, like startups, for example, food chains that have been once like a very small business from friends, like a vegan food business, and they expand restaurants like all over Switzerland, and they're coming big companies, and then you can't really uphold with the working rights and the conditions and also the products you use. Then suddenly you use mass products that are less expensive, so it gets away from sustainability again. So just tips, you have so many people that are around you, and often we don't even know our neighbors, which is very, very sad. So like trying to engage with the people around us and maybe really trying to work on yourself. Like that's very, very hard. And if you have mental illnesses, there is help out there that makes it easier for you to help yourself. Talking to people, using your social network, and having seasonal legumes and seasonal food.
That is actually interesting, because I think as a starting point for many people, this might be a bit unconventional, maybe. Say if they do want to shop for a new T-shirt or whatever, because they only have T-shirts with tears and they're, I don't know, lonely or whatever it is, really, the circumstances. Is there some kind of website or list where they can go and check for whether a brand, for example, is actually sustainable or whether it's just greenwashing?
I bet there are things like that, but I couldn't like list it right now. But what I know is that if you can build your own network through those, we have like social media. It's a problem, but also it helps us with a lot of things. So you can make your Facebook group where people come together and like try to, oh, I have this T-shirt for free. Yeah, I can give it. I don't use it anymore. Or I have this pair of shoes. Or oh my God, we have so many carrots in our garden and we can never eat them. Like, does anyone else need carrots? So like kind of use what we already have. And if there is no such network where you live, you can kind of create it because there is the need for it. Like eventually, if you start talking to people in your social environment, you realize that there is a need for such a social network, but it's often not very accessible to a lot of people. You're also not being too harsh on yourself for being perfect. The way our system works right now, there is a way to be 100% sustainable, and that's where you just like are often to the woods and very, very independent. But that's not the case for like everyone. And we live in the houses, in the buildings we are going to school or whatever. So you don't have to be perfect, but incorporating more and more and more things into the way you're living that are sustainable, and like talking a lot about what you would wish for the world to look like, and then also listening to indigenous people or people from the global south, what their problems are, and then trying to create this vision with everyone together. It's the small pieces that then add up, because it's always like if you talk with people, it's always very similar. Like it's just the basic needs of love, attention that need to be covered, and then food, or yeah, safety, security. And I guess with my activist friends, we're okay, yeah, we won't reach the 1.5-degree target, which is very, very sad and terrible, but at least we have each other. And we are now building structures, decolonizing ourselves. We are like connecting different struggles, different fights together, and getting really to the root causes, and then trying to build new structures upon a new system. And once the crisis or like the destruction of our world is really here, and people don't know what to do anymore. We already have the structures, and there's so many examples, like many little communities that are already independent, like working together, or Longomai, for example.
I find it fascinating when people are kind of reluctant to even just get informed more on the issues that we're having, not necessarily only environmentally, but it is kind of at the basis of everything, because if there's no earth, then there's no inhabitable space for us anymore. So that's kind of the basis of our being, really. But it is, I find, quite easy to get informed on different aspects of the issue. Like, for example, I was just listening to a podcast, and it's on the fishing industry that is affecting countries in Africa, indigenous people in countries such as Indonesia and so on. And it's actually quite interesting because, for example, it's not actually the local fishermen that causes the problem, or the illegal fishing that causes the problem, but it is actually legal fishing that is the biggest problem, because a fish can't reproduce at the rate that we are fishing them. So we're actually kind of emptying our seas, which is the very base of our existence, really, on this planet. But yeah, it's interesting that people seem reluctant to get informed, even when it's actually quite, with the internet, we have everything we need to have to be knowledgeable on a topic at our fingertips, really. There's a lot of misinformation, of course, but if you want to find credible information, I'm sure there is a lot out there. And so I'll have a podcast linked in the show notes as well, because I think that was a quite eye-opening one for me on the fishing industry.
Every one of us kind of knows how the iPhone is being produced or whatever, but still we are using these phones. And we also are aware about famines and hunger crisis, nature catastrophes everywhere around the world. Like, it's not a new thing. We all know the campaigns from UNICEF, Swiss Aid, the Red Cross, and still a lot of people are doing something, are being engaged. But like, it needed the climate crisis. It needed Europe to be affected from the climate crisis itself for people to glue themselves on the street in order to actually change something. But if I always wonder, like, what would have happened if the climate crisis would only target the continent Africa and the continent South America? Like, would people here in Europe also stick themselves to the streets or not? Like, I can really understand the motivation to stick yourself on the street. It's just like so tiring, and you see that the climate crisis is here, and it's just so shitty and unjust, and you're so frustrated. So, and you actually have the right to kind of use this civil disobedience because it's such a urgent crisis. But I just always ask myself, yeah, we are all using our phones, and we all know about the misery in other countries, but we never actually did something. And yeah, knowledge is accessible in like so many different ways. But still, we have like this cognitive dissonance. Like, so many people are still eating meat from the industry. We are using our phone. So how can we find different ways to educate people that are actually emotionally touching? If I analyze climate and people that are in my bubble, like, what connects us, we are all very rational and long-term thinking. So a study, a scientific report brings us onto the streets. But if my brother reads it, like, it touches him, he thinks, yeah, that's bad, but it doesn't bring him to move something. It doesn't lead him towards using his voice. So how can we find the ways to like touch so many different people? How can we find diversity in education or whatever?
I think it might be similar. Maybe this is a bit of a reach, but I think it might be similar to the paradox behavior in some people that we've seen during the lockdowns and COVID and all that. I think when people are on some level too scared, it's somehow, it seems that way, easier for them to look away instead of sticking up for each other. With COVID, it was obviously very much a solidarity issue. But I think with the climate crisis, which is going to affect us all earlier or later or whenever, but it's a human issue, really, a human race issue, the human population issue. And I think maybe on some level, people are too scared to actually look towards the issues that we have and that we have to change. And it's easier for them to just look away for the moment, for the
And
time
it's
being.
also yes, exactly. And it's also like not really bearable, because if you have all those norms and stories, you can't change anything anyways. And if you then are letting yourself touch from that, it's very, very devastating. So it's better to like get it as far away from you as possible. But I think like changes now, also thanks to social media, we're getting to know the people that are being affected from deconstructivism in a way, or deconstruction, exploitation on a personal level. Like I have so many friends whose lives are being targeted right now, and like young activist friends that lose their lives through military repression. That now that I know people that work in lithium fields, I have a complete different perspective on my phone that I had before, when I also was aware of how it was produced, but I didn't know anyone, so I wasn't emotionally like connected. But now that I have friends, I see it on a whole other level. So like, yeah, this is something where social media also helps.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that has to do with like the dissonance that you've mentioned before, when you don't have a face to a story. I guess that is part of the issue. But sooner or later, it's going to affect us all. So we'll just wait until then. Worst case, for them to wake up and realize that we have to do something.
But not just wait, but like building this trust structures, so we are prepared.
But wait in terms of like, because I feel like personally in my personal life, I try not to get into conversations or discussions really with people who are denying the fact that we're facing a climate crisis right now. Just trying to stay off of having discussions with people that are really ignorant to the topic, to be honest, because a lot of times there's no sense in wasting my time trying to convince them. When they don't even listen to scientists, they're not going to listen to me, obviously.
That's very important, like to figure out where I lose my time for with trying to convince people. But sometimes it's also very important to like talk to people outside your bubble, because often it's just like anxiousness that is being created through misinformation or whatever. I actually love speaking to the right-wing farmers in my region, because I have so many stereotypes upon them, and they have so many stereotypes upon me. But if we then like not trying to convince each other from our opinion, but actually listening to each other and figuring out what we need, trying to connect our dots and like working together, you realize that it's actually just like a very, very, very small mass that we can ignore and just let go and think. Not everybody, but a lot of people are already on the right side. They've just had a lot of misinformation, a lot of propaganda, and also a lot of like conditions that are being put on them. You have to be a farmer in this and this and this way in order to receive subventions or like money from the government. And if you don't do that this and this and this way, you won't receive any money for what you're doing. So even if it's like very harmful towards nature, you have to do it, or you think you have to do it in order to get money. Sometimes your mind is very not flexible and you think you do the right thing. Just that's also, I think, a big takeaway for me that I had through like leaving my bubbles, that actually already so many people are on the right side. They just have been suppressed.
That's a really interesting point.
This right-wing farmer is describing the crisis from his perspective, and I am describing the crisis from my perspective. So it's just very, very important to leave your bubble in order to build like this social human network or a human world. Some voices you have to ignore, but it's better to like bring in all the perspectives around the solution think tank instead of not inviting this right-wing farmer or not trying to understand those perspectives. Those big places on COP, Conference of Parties on the Climate Crisis or Biodiversity Crisis, they are like discussing those international solutions or whatever, and then we are thinking about why can't they be implemented but it doesn't even have to be the international spaces, also just the government in Switzerland, for example. Like a lot of very important perspectives on issues are just being excluded or not being taken seriously. On the Conference of Parties, there are almost only white men, sometimes also women, but also white, that are very rational. Like there is one specific rational Western scientific language that is being spoken. For example, indigenous people, they have a whole lot other way that they are using their language, but it's not less important, like not less valuable. It's just more of a storytelling that they can include their voices there is a lot harder. And then, for example, the voices of youth is also almost never heard or included in any of those spaces where rules are made or solutions are being discussed or issues or crises. I think that's something that needs to change. And that's also something that is very important. Like if you're discussing how should school future look like, but there are no students on board of this discussion, we will never find a solution that will actually fit because you've not included students.
Yeah, being dismissive of a group or part of the issue is definitely not going to lead to an inclusive solution.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
exactly.
true.
It's just you find a solution, but it's only working for some people, and for everyone else, it's still a suppression or exploitation or whatever. And indigenous voices are saying that, like, since a long time, hey, we don't just need to like fight the symptom of climate crisis with renewable energy, but we actually have to rethink the whole way we live together. And like, yes, using electric cars, but using less cars in general, having another way of mobility, expanding train systems or whatever.
Have you heard that in Switzerland, speaking of trains, which I'm always in favor of, like for efficiency reasons, as well as for being able to work while doing so or to read a book or whatever, but then, of course, for the ecological impact as well. Have you heard that in Switzerland they want to increase public transportation prices?
Yeah, we've heard of that.
Which is crazy because there's so many people driving in their cars all by themselves. There's practically no carpooling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just insane.
Yeah, that's one thing I think that should be improved upon is the public transport infrastructure in all places where it's somehow possible, and to make it affordable for, all kinds of people, no matter their income.
Definitely. Not equality for everyone, but equity, like having the same chances.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Yeah, because equality, you then just like this binary or whatever, like living the full biodiversity, not only letting our ecosystem thrive, but also gender diversity, like in every little spectrum, and then having the same chances to flourish.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that most of my guests have not spoken on equity as much as environmental activists on this podcast have.
Really?
It's interesting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
by far.
it's very interesting. That I raised this so much, or that this is very important to me, is because of all the conversations I had with indigenous and MAPA activists. So activists that are being most affected already.
Right.
But that's very interesting, yeah.
And now I wanted to ask you, where do you personally stand on having kids? And of course, on a private level, this is none of my business. I was just wondering for you to generally speak on the idea of having kids nowadays, because I do feel like a lot of people are not considering the fact that the future is not looking quite so good in terms of like natural catastrophes, shortages of water and food, overpopulation, and all the issues that go along with that, such as shortage of inhabitable space, pandemic situations, and so on. What would you recommend for our listeners to consider before having kids?
When I was little, I always wanted to have kids. Like, there is no question. And now, the more I get to know the world, and like what you've explained before, like there's really, do I really actually want my children be exposed to that? I think it is okay to have children, but we need to be aware of how much this is a responsibility. And we also need to be aware that there are so many children out there that kind of are being left alone. And like the children right now, they are our next generation. And if we want to change our system, we have to change the way we are raising these children. So yeah, just being aware that it's such a big responsibility. So yeah, I haven't figured it out for myself, so I can't really make recommendations or whatever, because I also think it's a very personal question for everyone, and everyone has to kind of answer it for themselves. Just like working on your own first, maybe before having children, or being aware of intergeneration trauma and whatever, to be able to like actually unconditionally love everyone should definitely have the chance to be unconditionally loved. Yeah, just maybe ask yourself, am I able to love the child that I'm setting into the world for whatever it is doing? But it's a hard question to answer, really.
Sure. Where does Switzerland stand right now in terms of decreasing the impact on the climate? What is the main focus for Switzerland, really?
I think the most important thing to do right now is to acknowledge that this story we are always telling, that we are always being told, and we tell ourselves to this day, that our wealth has been handmade from Swiss people, isn't actually true. Acknowledging our colonial past, acknowledging how we are intertwined in our international financial system, and that actually a lot of Swiss money is like being flooded into the wrong projects that are exploiting people and the earth more and more and more, and actually using the power that we have in this international financing system to like change the mechanisms in the root causes. For example, having not only regulations that are helping our economy to grow, but actually having regulations that are keeping humanity and our ecosystem safe. That for climate, I think this is like a campaign that is coming from the Global South, from Argentina, from the climate movement in Argentina, where they were trying to connect the climate crisis with the debt crisis, because people in the Global South are very aware what debt is and like how debt is being created. So you can mobilize a lot of people on the streets towards the debt issues, but the people from the climate movements, they couldn't mobilize people on the streets. So they were like asking themselves, like, why are going so many people on streets for debt, which is very a concerning factor. But why are not so many people are going on the streets against the climate crisis, which is like even more concerning and very more substantial. The deeper their investigations kind of got, they saw how interlinked actually these two crises, like the financial crisis and the climate crisis, are. Like they figured out more and more about how the IMF, this International Monetary Fund, that by the way, we in the global north, like almost no one knows what that is, but the people in the global south, they're going on the streets for these, and you see like graffitis everywhere where it says like injustice, misery, IMF, famine. So kind of making transparent how this debt issue is connected to the climate crisis through the IMF and the World Bank. Like it's very, very complicated. And the more you know, the more you're getting like confused. But the more you see clearly the way our economy works is causing all those crises. So, for example, with our decolonial history that I mentioned in this podcast already, with this like first credit the colonizers gave to the colonized countries, they made this first indebtment, and then with the whole development with interest charges, and then the different currencies. Like a lot of these countries have already paid back their debts a long time ago, but through these developments they haven't. They're still indebted. And then the IMF kind of holds this perspective up that countries have to be safe if they're nearly going bankrupt, that the IMF has kind of to save them and give them a credit again, which then creates again a lot of debt for the country if they accept the credit, but like also helps them. But the conditions under what credits are being distributed, like then causing the social sector to like get worse and worse and worse, or making countries like Ecuador, for example, letting big companies do extractions on oil and gas or minings, or like building new pipelines just to get in money to pay back the debt. Or they have to build a big nature reserve, and with that building this big nature reserve, they're displacing indigenous people. So it's like those conditions are creating a lot of misery in the countries that are receiving this credit. And the regulations that are, or the conditions, they're always like economic regulations and never social regulations and never ecological regulations. So if Switzerland would like actually push for other mechanisms, like the debt for climate is now has two demands. And first, that all the debts of the countries in the global south are being released. And secondly, that actually through this industrialization and through this CO2 budget that is so much higher in countries of the global north, the countries in the global north are actually responsible for the climate crisis. So they are actually indebted by the countries of the global south that have suffered already so much from nature catastrophes, that those countries like Pakistan then have to pay for themselves, like if they're being flooded or whatever. So they again can't invest the money into the social sector or in the ecological sector, but they have to invest in reparations. So the second demand is that the countries in the global north are paying for those reparations.
Which would actually render the argument that you brought up earlier about white privilege and white savior complex, that would actually render this argument mute. Because if it is due to, the North and white privilege and former colonization and all that, then, well, it's on these people exactly that they should be making these efforts, right?
Yeah, it is only on these people, like, actually. And but also on people like me. We've kind of, or like just acknowledging it and trying to amplify the voices from the global south that are like fighting against it since 5 decades and sharing the privilege we have, like not sinking down in misery and depression, but like kind of searching for help, that you're getting help with your anxiousness and your misery, and then using your privilege.
Well, I think that's a great use, because that is really the only thing where there's merit in it, I think, in privilege.
Maybe something that I really also think it's very important, like if I talk about those systematical, very, very big picture issues and how everything like is being tied together, just every little step is also a very big step. But we also have to see the big picture and like go on demonstration or using whatever tools.
Thanks so much for spending this big amount of time with me and informing our listeners. I think that's a really good next step as well, to just reach more people.
Definitely. And thank you for like listening.
Of course,
to me,
my pleasure.
And my answers and for your questions.
I wish you good luck for your work.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Upfront Podcast. If you haven't already, give us a follow and join in the conversation on Instagram and Facebook at The Upfront Podcast. Take care and see you next time.